We've been running these webinars once a month on Wednesdays throughout the fall and winter for a few years and have had a variety of great speakers discussing exciting local initiatives, research, and projects happening in our watershed and beyond. And these webinars will provide the opportunity for you to learn something new and ask some questions over your lunch hour. So a few housekeeping items before we start off. Our webinar will be recorded and later shared on our YouTube channel. You can also see our past Watershed Wednesday series videos there as well. And we would also appreciate that you keep your microphone muted during the presentations. Also maybe turn videos off just to keep our bandwidth. And there will be a Q&A period during the last 10 minutes of the webinar. So we ask that you use the chat feature to post your questions right in there. Oh, I didn't have that screen up, but there you go. And starting off in a good way, in the spirit of respect and reciprocity, the North Saskatchewan Watershed Alliance acknowledges that the lands within the watershed of the North Saskatchewan River are in Treaty 6, Treaty 8, and the Métis homeland. These lands are the traditional territories, traveling routes, and gathering places of the Cree, Saulteaux, Blackfoot, Métis, Dene, Stoney, and Nakota Sioux. We recognize and thank the Indigenous peoples who have cared for this land since time immemorial and whose rich histories, cultures, languages, and presence continue to enrich these sacred lands that we all steward as treaty people. We invite participants to learn about the Indigenous peoples whose lands you reside, and I welcome you to reflect on your place within the watersheds. So if you'd like, you can please share in the chat where you're dialing in from today, which treaty area or just location. All right, so we're joined by Dr. Pattison and Dr. Swallow. Thank you for joining us today. They'll be sharing their insight and expertise gained from research and experience with agriculture from both an Albertan and international lens. Following the two presentations, as mentioned, we'll have some time for a Q&A session. So starting us off is Dr. John K. Pattison Williams. He's an adjunct professor at the University of Alberta and president of Pattison Resource Consulting Limited, a company specializing in the interaction between environmental conservation and economic development. He lives in the Miquelon Lake area and is active on the family farm, raising blue roan quarter horses with his spouse and two boys. So thanks for joining us today, and I'll let you take it away.
Great, thank you so much, Jillian. Let me just share my screen. And make sure the windows are all in the right spot. There we go. All right, so yes, thanks so much, Jill. Really appreciate the welcome, and real pleasure to be here today with all of you. I'm putting my timer on so that I don't go over, and for the second speaker, for Dr. Swallow. I'd want to just first of all acknowledge, as we heard, that we are in the homeland of the treaty. We're in the Treaty 6 area here is where I am sitting, the homeland of many First Nations, Métis, and other peoples, and we are so thankful to be on this land. And as we were talking just before the meeting, I'm sitting here in a little, we call it our guest house. It's like a little cabin on our land, and it's pretty close to the Great Divide between the North Saskatchewan watershed and the Battle River watershed. So this is a place that holds a lot of meaning and love for me. My family has farmed here for several generations, so it's lovely to be introduced and invited to speak here. I just want to briefly, in these 15 to 20 minutes, outline a few things. And I'm going to talk today a bit about agriculture and nature smart climate solutions, and with specifically around wetlands. And so I'll look at a little bit of the values of them, the costs of them, and use a case study from a recent paper I published and collaborated on in Saskatchewan. And then touch a little bit personally on some of our own story here on the land and choices we've made on our farming operation. And I know many of you, well, I can't see who's in the room at the moment, but I'm sure many of you represent the different sectors of this watershed and different people and have different stories. And so it might resonate with some of you and it might not, but I hope that some of it will stick with you. And I wanted also to just put this map here on as I start in terms of the outline. This is the plow print that has been published by Gauge in 2020, but they update this with the US Geological Survey every couple of years. And I find this a very telling visualization of the Great Plains and the prairie pothole region that we reside in right up in the northern bit. As you can see, the white area is the land that's been changed by human activity. And I think, well, quite naturally, plow prints, where we do crop agriculture as well. And it's a bit disconcerting, actually, as a farmer to look at that and think, wow, we have really changed this landscape. And I want you to hold this sort of visualization in your mind as I carry on to the next few parts of this presentation. And this is the land from a drone looking over some of our land and that we farm and ranch. And you see in this area that, you know, there's these wetlands that have a great sort of connection. And I have lots of stories of hiking and hunting and even canoeing here. But one other part down in the bottom right, that's the tip of Second Miquelon Lake. And one thing that's really always sort of sticks with me is that when I'm not that old. I mean, I'm getting up there, but I'm not that old. And when I was 10 or 12, the water from Second Miquelon touched up all on those trees. And we would canoe, we would swim, and it was an amazing place to go and play, aside from when the mosquitoes were too bad in the summer. And this was taken, I think, 2 years ago, this photo. And, you know, even this summer, it looks like it'll be even lower. And I think that's sort of this context also we're sitting within of climate change. And yes, there are cyclical patterns that do occur, but, you know, human-induced climate change, I think there's ample evidence for it. And we're seeing the real impacts of it here in central Alberta. And in response to that, there has been a concept called nature-based climate solutions, and are these nature-based solutions that are part of some of our international agreements and national agreements around how do we reduce our carbon emissions. And Canada is a very sort of richly endowed, large geographic area that has lots of natural habitat. This is one of those tools that we were thinking of. How do we keep what we have on the land that can maintain that sort of withdrawing and sequestering of carbon from the atmosphere? And so Environment and Climate Change Canada has funded a lot of work on nature-based climate solutions. And this term is around restoration and conservation and management of different ecosystems, grasslands, wetlands, coastlines, and forests. And all with sort of the intent to think about how do we adapt to the impacts of climate change and support the biodiversity on the landscape. So we're going to focus on wetlands here today. But even this slide could be put into a whole lecture. And I know a colleague of both Brent and mine, Dr. Adamovich, has some good presentations on that. But I want to start with this idea of wetlands and think of, you know, we've probably all heard and been taught in school around the benefits of wetlands. And as a sort of a disciplinarily trained economist, you think of some of these terms like non-market, like ecosystem services. And this is a sort of a figure from the UN Environment Program that sort of summarizes some of the statements around what are the services that natural landscapes can provide. And you think of regulating air quality, et cetera, and supporting nutrient cycling, the cultural values of place, and then those sort of more standard provisioning services that are of food and fiber and fuel that are more naturally traded in the sort of traditional marketplace. And so wetlands themselves are very rich sources of flood control and carbon sequestration and biodiversity enhancement and nutrient removal. And it's, you know, these things we talk about and we think about. But I would be remiss, and if any of you have ever heard me speak before, I always include this quote, sort of try to ram it into any context. Nowadays, people know the value of everything and the price of nothing. And this is a quote from Oscar Wilde in the 1700s. And I think is as applicable then as it is now. And I think how we think about valuing these services is tricky and is challenging. But I think it needs to be done. And, when we start this term non-market valuation, this really was my first foray into wetlands and into economics, was during my master's degree working with Dr. Boxall and Dr. Adamovich, where we looked at sort of those benefits, those ecosystem services, and what the general public in Manitoba would be willing to pay for them. And for some riveting reading tonight, if you want to go find this article, it'll, it's so stimulating, you might not fall asleep. But it basically, it talks a little bit, we put some values on it, use some modeling approaches to find that, the average Manitoban resident, we surveyed 2,000 people, would pay about $200 a year to maintain these natural ecosystems because of all those services. Now that's well and good, right, to talk about the values, but as there's another component to that, and that's the costs of keeping them. And I think the benefit side needs more current research and more focus. But over the last probably, I don't know, 10 years or so, I've been working a little bit on some things around for producers themselves. Why are they doing this? What are the costs? And this is near to my heart as a part of a family farm that, maybe 2,000 acres of grain and then a lot of natural pasture and bushland as well. But so what's going on out there? What's going on in the sort of producer mindset? And I've sort of 3 papers I'm highlighting here. And I want to just, again, acknowledge my colleagues on each of them. I just thought they would fit this talk quite well. And one is one with Dr. Creed from Toronto. Another one, is some work I did with Fiera Consulting and Sherry Clare. As a friend and colleague, we did some work on agricultural drainage in central Alberta. And then this example on the left of some of the precision agricultural data in Saskatchewan. So we've been exploring these things, and I'll dive into them with a bit of detail, which can hopefully stimulate some conversation. But from this paper in 2021, we looked at sent aerial drones over some quarter sections in central Alberta. And we really found, I guess, we're doing this sort of profitability mapping. And through relationships I had built with these producers, they were able to share their data from their combines and seed drills. And we were really looking at what was their yield effect and then some profitability on each of these areas. And I think what we found, which is never always fun, but it's diverse, it's heterogeneous, and it's sort of things are different in each place. But what are the sort of the narratives we're finding that drained wetlands are not always the most profitable places. They can be, but there's higher risk associated with flooding and yield effects that don't always enhance the profitability as much as sort of the narrative amongst the agricultural community might always hold. The idea, well, if we drain it, we'll get lots of yield and more financial benefit from it. Of course, that's not even realizing there is a wetland policy in Alberta, and you can't drain without approvals. But we'll touch on that sort of interesting feature a little later. But basically, a lot of these drained wetlands were not providing the profitability that were hoped for by the producers. And also I'll mention on that too, is that, and yet when we talked with those producers after this, like, yeah, they're not. And yet I still think it's probably just easier if we got rid of them. And these are great, wonderful people that are, just that tension of sort of conservation and sort of making a living on their land it's a hard one. It's a very challenging one. So I want to focus then a little in more detail on an example in Saskatchewan that some of my colleagues and friends from the University of Saskatchewan and then the PAMI Institute worked on. And this is, I'm particularly acknowledging Liam Bolt. He's was a graduate student and now a research associate on this project. He really took the lead on this. So I really want to acknowledge Liam. And this is on his family farm north of Saskatoon. And basically the context of this, very similar here to the Edmonton North Saskatchewan Watershed Alliance Watershed here. you see the sort of the spring variability in flooding and just this high sort of degree of drainage on the landscape, and also high degree of sort of where the water is pooling in these sort of natural wetlands. And so this background as we speak about, and I think it's often the rub in these discussions, is there are economic incentives for crop producers, which has driven wetland loss and or consolidation, depending on your province in the prairies. And so keep this idea of opportunity costs is like, well, if you keep them on the landscape, that's land that you've paid for that you're not, getting any sort of profit from or yield and sort of crop from. And then there's these ideas of nuisance costs. We have to drive around these sort of, it's not a straight line. And I think that's something as agricultural equipment gets larger, you see a lot of clearing going on right now, all across the prairies, from trees to wetlands. It's very prevalent right now. And so there's lots of sort of ideas about nuisance costs and input costs identified in some of these articles. And then also this idea of land values, that we're really, seeing such an increase in prices. A quarter section in this area 20 years ago, $70,000, maybe a little more, and now $500,000 to $600,000. So this is really pushing some of these land values, push some of that conversion too. And then, of course, contrary with these benefits that we've touched on already. And so then there's this disparity between who bears the costs. Is it the landowners and farmers that are doing these things that society reaps the benefits from? And this challenge of little financial incentive to conserve. And so there's been a reticence on behalf of provinces and governments to sort of annual payments for these in the face of financial challenges anyway. Really want to note the Alice program and the Weston Foundation for coming in various places and doing some really excellent work to see about sort of incentivizing and conservation. But what we want to look here is even more so, what are those details? It's not just, the paper we did with Sherry in 2021, but this work was to look at that sort of underlying precision agricultural data, to look at productivity and farm financial performance. And so, this is our family's, my brother-in-law might say that, well, that's my tractor and seed drill. Fair enough. I don't have to pay for it. But this is on our farm. This is our, the equipment right now we use for seeding. And that looks very different than it did when my dad was seeding and I was younger. Things change very swiftly. But this also means, that we have this technology to track exactly inputs and shut off areas so that we actually can be more efficient in the inputs. And so in this study, though, there was in the black and brown soil zones, there's data from over 7 years, 20 different fields, 16 different fields of all this information, which is really rich. And then we're looking at wetland buffer zones extending 50 meters amongst 4 different crops for a total of about nearly 80,000 wetland and buffer zone yield observations. And this is some of the information just looking at the mean yield as a percentage of the field average. You can see in drained and intact and farmed and partially drained wetlands in terms of those different crops. And you can see the variability shows through, and also that, sometimes when it's drained, it's not always as high and equal to the other parts of the field. And then in terms of bringing in sort of some of the models, there's some yield effects were included in this farm financial analysis to look about changes under different scenarios, current conditions, full drainage scenario, and then a full restoration scenario. And note that, I'm moving swiftly, but you can read this paper too for more detail. But these are some of the results that we're seeing here, and in the black soil zone and the brown soil zone under full drainage and full restoration. And I guess 2 points. The main results show that the whole farm net benefits, they improve with drainage and decline with restoration, though there are changes. This sometimes strikes at my heart as someone that really wants to think, hey, let's keep some wetlands. It's good to have wetlands on the landscape. And then within that, a subset is that no sectional control scenarios really result in even greater wetland conservation costs. And so this idea that actually that precision agriculture can really assist in reducing some of the costs of having that on the land. Again, just because of time, I'll just say, we can chat more about this or refer to the paper. And so you think, okay, there are, in absence of a policy or incentives, there is a reason that people are, farmers are crop producers are out wanting to sort of make a little bit more land and not have to go around as much. And that's a hard one to think about. And so then we can augment some of this from 2 different producer surveys and looking at, even this 38% of producers report higher than average yields in wetland areas, while 45% show lower. And isn't that interesting? It just shows that no 2 wetlands are the same, and it's a very sort of localized discussion needs to occur. More data there around, when they harvested a crop in 2 out of 5 years or less. And then also, there's more around the sort of a public survey on taxation. So this contrast between a producer and a public survey. So the implications are that, wetlands they can be costly to farmers, but that varies. There's benefit from precision agriculture, but there is value still to society. So this is something that, we carry on this conversation. It hasn't been solved, and even in the presence of wetland policies. And as many of you have heard, Saskatchewan just adopted the Saskatchewan agricultural water management policy in end of January of this year. So we'll see, hopefully some as that plays out on the land, we'll see some information about it. And I guess to conclude, I'm concluding here. Wetlands they're a fascinating part of our landscape. And it does come down to this idea of choice, although there is a policy landscape that prevents activity. There are incentive programs, Ducks Unlimited or ALICE in some counties do exist. This is on one of our quarters. We did make that decision to restore wetlands on this quarter, about 10 acres of them. You're paid at a market value for that. So $2,000 or $3,000 an acre, and then which is divided between some annual payments and an initial lump sum. But it always comes down to I think some of that attitudinal, that human dimensions component of wetland conservation, that it still is that choice on these private landscapes, especially when it's sort of historical drainage activities. And I guess, where to from here? I don't know if I've helped anything on the conversation. And my timer's going. It's complicated, but there's a difference between, I think, complicated and complexity. So I think actually the better word would be it's complex to know how to navigate wetland conservation on different areas. In some ways, maybe it's complex, but it's not as complicated. Because we know that these are landscapes that have value to society, and there's excellent work being done. So even as we navigate the complexity, we hope we can still keep that vision in mind of these natural solutions to great national and international issues such as climate change, but all the other attached services that these landscapes provide, like water filtration and biodiversity. These all kind of can link together and show that, hey, let's keep moving forward and taking action on these landscapes. And I like to conclude this. This is our son. He's 5. This is just overlooking where we like to camp along Second Miquelon Lake, and kind of sticks me in the gut when I think, we were canoeing with him 2 years ago on that water, and that's last summer. It was pretty well gone, and there's reasons for that. But I really hope that this landscape can still be something that our kids can enjoy and see, that is wet, that has wildlife, that has all these wonderful things on it into the future. I'll turn you over to Brent now, but I will acknowledge these partners that I've worked with. Again, University of Alberta, Saskatchewan, University of Toronto, Irina Creed, Fiera with Sherry Claire, the Smart Prosperity Institute, PAMI Center, all these wonderful groups, and Environment and Climate Change Canada. And of course, the North Saskatchewan Watershed Alliance for inviting me here today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, John. It's great way to end it off. Perfect. So I will just do a quick share to welcome Brent. Brent Swallow is professor in the Department of Resource Economics and Environmental Sociology at the University of Alberta, Canada. He's a native of Saskatchewan and earned his bachelor's and master's degrees from the University of Saskatchewan and PhD from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. The professional experience from Western Canada and the Global South. Lived and worked in Africa between 1984 and 1987, and again between 1991 and 2009, where he led research at the National University of Lesotho, the International Livestock Research Institute, and the World Agroforestry Center. Since coming to the U of A in 2009, he has served as member of the Edmonton Food Council, trustee of Biodiversity International in Rome, and independent advisor to the Water, Land, and Ecosystems Program in Sri Lanka. Now teaches environmental policy and works with colleagues on research projects on farmland conversion, housing affordability, and the links between greenhouse gas emissions and grazing management, avoided conversion of peatlands, and methane emissions from feedlots. Okay, so I'll let you take it away, Brent. And thanks again for joining. Oh, sorry, you're muted, Brent. No problem. Just the unmute button on Zoom.
Okay.
Oh, you got it.
You have me now?
Yeah, perfect. Thanks.
So I apologize for making the switch between entertaining research and informative research seminar to lecture. So I'm going into my lecture mode. This doesn't really build on much of my own research specifically, but quite a bit the research efforts that I was involved with here, but also when I was doing more work in the Global South. My background is from Treaty 2 and Treaty 4 areas of Saskatchewan on the banks of the Pipestone Valley. So unfortunately, don't have a beautiful view of the Pipestone Valley, but was a wonderful place to grow up. In the mid-1970s, the first Ducks Unlimited wetlands were protected nearby us. So I think it's exciting that to think about what has been accomplished and what more there is to be done. So I thought that you might benefit from some kind of international perspectives a little bit on managing resources under climate change, kind of the threat. So kind of a global background is a reminder. So many things that you know. What's special about water? It's essential for life, directly or indirectly through food and health. Safe, adequate water is essential for human rights. There are public good features of non-excludability and non-rivalrous of both water and water infrastructure. Water is highly variable across time and space. The high prevalence of transboundary river basins, as John showed in his opening slides, create the need for governance of water resources at multiple scales. So that is kind of one of the last points that I'll focus on the most. Just a reminder, we are relatively low water stress as a nation compared to other nations of the world. So there are places in the world that are decades ahead of us in terms of their experience in dealing with scarce water supplies and water availability. Including places like Australia and South Africa and the Middle East. So we had the opportunity to learn from those experiences in a situation where we're relatively plentiful water supplies. And we should be able to see what are the lessons we can learn from other places that are more restricted water supplies. Water for agriculture, the amount that's allocated is very, very low in Canada. Less than 5% of all of the water available in our country is allocated to agriculture, which compares to parts of the Middle East and North Africa, where it's over 40% of all waters allocated to agriculture. So the irrigation areas of southern Alberta is, the main irrigated area of Canada, but we are relatively under allocating water to agriculture compared to other regions in the world. We're lucky to be able to mostly rely on rain-fed agriculture. Just kind of the big picture at a more global scale of water governance, thinking about modernization as a first kind of imperative for water governance, and the modernization imperative led to the prior appropriation rights system, or first in time, first in right system that we have still here in Alberta. Other parts of the world have moved on from this, as in places where water is much more scarce. So in some sense, we're lucky that we can have this as our main approach to water governance. As water becomes more scarce, you see these other trends kicking in, and this is detailed by the Woodhouse and Mueller article. Managing water to make it more effective use of sunk governance investments was kind of a first trend, is that while there's, in some places, there are very plentiful supplies of water, there's less plentiful supplies of water which are under management. As we see greater scarcity still, then we see the possibility of using market or non-market instruments to allocate scarce water between uses and users. So a country like the Philippines, for example, has had kind of national level dialogues about what are the priority uses of water. And for them, agriculture had to be a lower priority than human use in some industries. So we get different non-market allocations, as well as looking at where might the market play a role in allocating water. For further along still is recognizing environmental protection as a specific goal of water governance, and so as a legitimate and important use of water. The fact that when we have different uses and users of water, and water has these fractal properties in terms of water hydrology, there is a need to involve multiple stakeholders in water governance. And most recently, or not most recently, but starting about 20 to 30 years ago, is integrated water resource management, which is some way what the watershed councils are kind of modeled on here in Alberta and elsewhere. IWRM is, I was in Kenya at the time that IWRM was being promoted as the new water approach for all of the countries of Africa by the World Bank. They were so effective that really every country, not every, but virtually every country in Africa has very similar water law that follows these principles of integrated water resource management. So it was really a kind of movement toward that, and supported by the bank and the International Water Partnership. And these were the 4 principles of that must be very familiar with to you guys from the Dublin Statement on Water and Sustainable Development. Recognizing fresh water is finite and vulnerable. Water management should follow a participatory approach, that there's a critical role that women play in the provision, management, safeguarding of water, and that water has an economic value and all its competing uses should be recognized as an economic good. I've done some specific work in Kenya on gendered consequences of water limits and gender as a contributor to successful collective action in spring protection. And we found generally that women were the main providers of water. The main beneficiaries from clean water were women because they were responsible for the provisioning of health and food for their families. But women had, there was limited roles for them in informal water management institutions that made it very difficult for them to kind of play the role that would be best for them. And what was needed for successful collective action was for men to step into roles they had not been involved with in the past and take on greater roles. So just thinking about kind of where are we moving, where have we moved since IWRM was first kind of brought to the fore, certainly with the Sustainable Development Goals, with 3 of them specifically related, Sustainable Development Goals. So we've got that integrated and holistic solutions is one of the principles of the set of 17 goals. 3 of them are directly related to water, energy, and food. So SDG 2, ending hunger. SDG 6 is all about availability and sustainable management of water. SDG 7 is all about energy. So the rest of this presentation, I'm going to kind of move us toward water, energy, food nexus approaches. And may or may not be a language that you're familiar with. Certainly, when I was with an advisor to the Global Research Program on Water with the International Water Management Institute, this is something that they centered a lot of their research on and linked all of their work on water to climate change. And so by broadening from just water climate change interface to the water, energy, food interface with climate change, they felt that they had much greater possibility of being relevant and to having sustainable solutions. That is further picked up. We're thinking about climate, having climate change kind of push the agenda along with countries under the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, Paris Accords, needing every 5 years to make statements of their nationally determined contributions. So if you look at those documents in terms of how they will contribute to reducing greenhouse gas emissions and how they adapt to climate change, and how many of those specifically mention food, energy, and water. Almost all of them do, and the nexus approach is sort of natural in that context. So a little bit like John was saying about the nature-based solutions. This is in a way, not just thinking about kind of feeding ourselves versus protecting the environment, but thinking about what are the pressure points that are created at the interface by climate change at the interfaces of water and energy, water and food, energy and food, and so on. So this is the kind of the idea of the nexus from a diagram produced by Food and Agriculture Organization in 2021. So think about water, energy, and food at the 3 periphery areas, and then water and sort of climate change and GHG emissions. So we've got an interface between water and energy regarding water for energy, whether it's used for cooling, for hydropower production, or for extraction. And then energy for water. So water irrigation is is energy intensive action. In the bottom 2, energy and food interface, there's energy for food, energy for cattle feed, energy for producing fiber. On the other hand, the fiber produced from an agriculture sector can be used for energy production, and crops out of an agriculture section also can be used as biofuels for energy, and energy versus food interface. And then a third interface between water and food is water for food, and then how agriculture practice affect water resources, like what the work that John just described. And having to think about all these interfaces to come up with a climate solution is important, especially in light of the changes that are expected by 2050, when is seen as kind of our time to have achieved as a global community net zero emissions. By that time, we expect the projections are that there would be an 80% increase in water use, need for water, 55% increase in energy consumption. a 60% increase in food consumption. So these are, major challenges. They have that complex and complicated nature that John just talked about. So I thought so what are the experience with solutions? How does this nexus approach help us? I think it does help many countries to articulate how they will approach climate change and both adapt to climate change and reduce emissions, which are contributing to climate change. In addition, there is what are the kind of nexus solutions? One is sort of two just examples here that are from experiences from an international perspective. One is the idea of polycentric water governance. So if there are different organizations involved, maybe it's important to recognize them in a descriptive way, to recognize there are different sources of power. So there, we may think about a federal government, provincial government, municipal government, First Nations governments, as well as organizations like the North Saskatchewan Watershed Alliance, which all wields a softer type of power. So what are the types of power wielded by different organizations? And how do they overlap with each other? So we have this kind of descriptive part, which is just describing how they overlap. So you can think about pressure points and places of synergy or conflict. You can also think about this polycentric governance as in a normative way to say, if we have complex things to govern, we should need to match that complexity with complexity of our institutions, that it's a desirable thing to have. And I think that would be an interesting point for Watershed Alliance people to talk through. A second example is more technical, and this one, especially the water research program in Sri Lanka spent a lot of time on this, was the idea of something like solar-powered irrigation pumps. Another example that I was familiar with from Indonesia, I've spent a little bit of time in Indonesia and in India, is small hydropower as kind of nexus technical solutions. And just one, so this is about what do we know about markets. So this is another kind of institutional solution is markets. I think the overall the conclusion so far from this Garrick, Whittakin, and Kogan 2013 paper is that markets may be best where you really have weak publicly provided water supplies. If you have very well-functioning public water supplies, you probably don't have a good fit with markets. So there are places around the world where the public water system is very poor. Markets may be better that they are they are trying to meet needs. There's a possibility, though, that markets can crowd out domestic uses of water for greater efficiency and greater profit. And so maybe the best that can be done overall is to use prices to reduce waste, cover infrastructure and maintenance costs, and allocate water among users with similar uses. And I would say it looks like that for this temporary reallocation of water among irrigators in Alberta seems to be an example of that. Water pricing, we might think about what lessons can we learn from uniform rate pricing versus increasing block rate prices versus declining block rate prices. So the declining block rate structure, more like volume discounts, where an increasing block rate structure, so where the people who use the smallest amounts pay the highest price, compared to increasing block rate prices, where you give people who use the lowest amounts pay the lowest unit price, and people who use the greatest amounts of water pay the highest unit prices, which might be more consistent with water as a human right. You may set your minimum price at zero for a certain amount of water, and certainly South Africa has done that to help guarantee its right to water. So just a last comment. Oh, sorry, I missed a. Okay. I missed a slide. So I just say I'll just leave this off now. Is that from the the solar powered water pumps in Rajasthan in India, there's a experience of there's an experience with really being successful in reducing diesel production, reducing overuse of water, reducing greenhouse gas emissions, increasing water availability, increasing yields, increasing the amount that people are putting in fruits and vegetables. So these solar powered water pumps are really seen as kind of fundamental going forward. Just one last thing is, from all of this experience, is what about how should water be governed? And that's something you all know more about than I do. So I'll stop there.
Great. Thank you so much, Brent.
You're welcome.
Awesome. Very interesting. It was all very relevant in the times right now, especially with Alberta looking at issues with drought and considering water transfer and irrigation licenses. So I will just spotlight all of us here, and we'll begin the Q&A portion. So we do have some questions in the chat. Great. So I think some of these first few are related to John's presentation. So the first is that wetlands support greater biodiversity. The resident wildlife and pollinators help keep crops healthy and productive. Oh, this is just more of a comment. It's horrifying to hear the clearing of those spaces are continuing at such a pace. Agreed.
Good comment, and it is disconcerting, right? I think we use, I don't know, there was a thought that if people are more educated or understand that, or there's policies in place that would stop, but yeah, it's not.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's difficult, especially with the graph you pulled up showing that in a lot of cases, wetland clearing does benefit the bottom line for producers. So that kind of is related to one question from Shell Hildebrand. In the study that showed increased yield and productivity with drainage, was there also a calculation involved that looked at input cost? My guess is that having intact wetlands would allow for less irrigation and herbicide cost, among others. Was there a look at production income versus output costs?
Yeah, those are embedded in several of the models in that study and in others. I think so that overall productivity has to include those sort of herbicides and fertilizer costs as well. Yeah, it's still challenging. I think many of the themes still remain the same despite some individual changes. So yeah,
makes sense. It might vary with the type of crop.
Mm-hmm.
Or considerations with irrigation and whether it has been a dry few years, maybe having more wetlands on the landscape can help overall, but for the average farmer.
This study and a lot of the work I've done hasn't been in the irrigated landscapes of the South. So this is, that changes a lot of the dynamics around the property prices and input costs around, the cost of some of those spivets and that sort of thing. But yeah, so that's something, it's a good point, something to think about. Another thing around herbicide use has changed in the last 10 years too. I think we used to do one sort of sweep in June when the crop is young. But I'd say now is almost 4 to 5 applications of herbicide each year. There's a pre-burn off. There's right after the crop is young. There's sometimes a fungicide sort of application. And then typically after prior sort of a desiccation prior to harvest for some of the crops, so there can be straight cut heading, and then sometimes even a post burn off. So I mean, it's just been a real change. I think with respect to another comment I saw around farm sizes, and I think that has been a massive change. I think farm sizes used to be, a 1,000-acre farm was pretty good in this Edmonton area. That was a pretty big sized operation. Now we're expanding, you don't really want to see people moving off the landscape, but an average farm, I don't know what it'd be, but many of our neighbors are up to 5,000 to 10,000 acres now. And so that isn't abnormal. And then in other parts of the Southeast and Saskatchewan, 40,000 acre farms. Like it's just really a changing demographic.
Interesting. Yeah, okay. Well, I think I have another question actually for Brent. Just wondering, interesting map you showed of the water use kind of at an international level with some of those red zones and how water use will increase maybe in that 60 to 80% range. So what do you think will be the impact maybe on a province like Alberta, where we have so much agricultural production in southern areas, but a little less water overall? There's been considerations about watershed transfer agreements. Do you think that's something that will have to be looked at, or maybe a controversial question, but
So I would, I mean, the types of agreements that I'm familiar with so far seem to be done at pretty minimal cost in terms of what's being given up compared to what's been gained as a water use. So if you are giving up an inefficient water system, making a water movement system more efficient, you're giving up very little and gaining quite a bit in terms of the alternative use that was shifted to. Just think about the cross iron mills example. Yeah, and I guess the other examples that are under discussion in the Old Man River Basin, these are some of these transfers I think are they're bound to happen with increasing frequency. And I guess the issue is, do we have the right institutions around? So it's made quite sticky, right? It's quite hard to move water uses. Temporary reallocations among irrigators is much easier to organize. So that given that they have that at an out, it's unlikely, I guess, that farmers would have transfers among them. So we've got two mechanisms for water to move around in southern Alberta. And I guess they may be, because our water stress is so low compared to other parts of the world, we may be able to afford slow institutional innovation compared to other parts of the world to much faster need as things get more and more scarce. So it means it's a good news for us in learning from other places, right? We can, like Murray Darling is a good example from Australia of a place that we can learn more from.
they use sort of a market-based approach there?
Right, yeah.
Looks like.
Yeah, so I think they do an annual auction of water licenses there. And depending on availability, because there's still high temporal variability, right? Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah, instead of having those really old licenses that have stayed around for many years. Interesting. Okay, so I think there's a few more questions in here. Kelsey's wondering, I think for John, have you seen a transition in farming practices such as small scale, large farms towards company, large scale operations? What are your general thoughts around this? Oh, I guess you did actually kind of answer that one with it, but any other thoughts there?
Yeah, I think even the shift from large family farms to more corporate operations. Yeah, I mean, it is happening. There's reasons for it, but I lament that. I wish that wasn't the case. And I think it comes at a cost to biodiversity and to communities and all of these other sort of more social narratives. So yeah, it's happening.
Another question as well. Yeah, maybe be a bit more complex, but it kind of relates to our last webinar looking at the kind of monetary value of natural ecosystem services. So in the study about yield effects of drainage of wetlands, were other ecosystem services of wetlands compared with the yield values, including the non-market services?
So they aren't in this particular ones that I showed here. I did some work, it's not published yet, but for the Saskatchewan Water Council, the Saskatchewan Research Council, and that did overlay those in. And those are more challenging numbers to quantify. But when they are put in, it does bring that much more close. And they need to be part of that conversation and that economic formula. So it does bring them much. So then it's not just the simple, well, they make financial sense to drain. Well, they actually don't when you bring also that, however you want to call it, additionality, or putting in, stacking those services. But that wasn't shown in these ones. But it's just a challenge how you communicate that in terms of policy when, there's often not hard numbers on that. There's not markets to form it. So you're using approaches like benefit transfers and survey techniques to try to get to the truth of those, but it's challenging. And I can comment too. I just see Kim B from Leduc. Thanks for that comment. You're right. Large farms are often still family-based. We're connected with lots of them, lots of our friends. And yet the kids my age or younger that are part of it, like, so you have 12 combines, you're a worker on the program, or they're not out doing it in the same way. So they may be family-based, and it's great to maintain that narrative, but that's also be aware that, it's a different style, I think, than it was. And not disparaging that style. There's still good there, right? And then also there's just a big trend towards shifting away from even the family corporate model to just a large corporate farm. But yeah, thanks for that comment. I can still be sad about the nice 10,000 or 1,000-acre farm where you can get out and be part of it, and sort of lament that change because we're forced by the market. I think there's just, it's quite a big reality right now, and I kind of wish we weren't so beholden to Cargill and B3 and Pattison grain. It'd be nice. So sorry to any of the Cargill folks on the call.
All right. We might have time for one more question. It kind of could be maybe answered by both of you parts of it. Are there any studies done of the increase in soil salinity due to the increase of application of fertilizers, pesticides, and herbicides? Wetlands would tend to help filter that. Also, using the old shelter belt model, decreasing the shrubs and trees along wetlands would contribute to further soil erosion from winds. Would the practice of regenerative agriculture fit into nature-based solutions? Lots there, and I know there's been also increases in water salinity just from road salts, so another one.
Brent, do you want to answer that one?
So I can, there was a 200-person conference on soil health here last week, and which I didn't go to. So I think that there's certainly the speakers at that. I know that they have done a lot of work on salinity. So it'd be interesting to get the program for that conference by the Alberta Soils Association, and just look at the presentations made at that conference. Certainly, I've done more work in South Asia where massive problems of increasing soil salinity and to extent to which breeding of saline tolerant crops is really at the fore. This is and the overuse of the shift from canal irrigation to groundwater irrigation and the declining water tables associated with that have massive problems. So this is at a global scale. This is a huge issue.
Yeah, soil degradation, that will be another issue to tackle.
And if I could jump on that, regenerative agriculture definitely fits into, even though Brent's talking there, but even, nature climate solutions, natural climate solutions. And, there's with the federal program with AFSC on that, there's a lot of great work being done on regen agriculture. It tends to be palatable, right? And think of the way, how do we do these? So farmers tend to be more, I think, more interested in that.
Interesting. All right. Well, I think
maybe I can just Lucian's one more part of that comment was about shelter belts. It seems that the most impactful program and experience is in Quebec within Canada of managing waterways and trees along waterways. There are pretty large carbon payments that have come from those. So they seem to have developed a recipe that works well technically and also provides good returns to farmers. So that might be an example to consider.
Definitely something we're interested in at NSWA with the riparian health and our riparian web portal, trying to showcase those projects that conserve riparian areas in agriculture and just everywhere, basically. But yeah, all really great thoughts. And I think we have come to the end. I think there might be a couple little questions we missed. Actually, no, I think we got them all. So great job. We were efficient there. So, well, thank you guys so much for joining us today. It was a really great webinar overall, and I think all awesome ideas. Getting my brain working with all of this stuff for the future. So thanks, guys. So I think I will just quickly share my screen to just discuss our next webinar for April. So next time, April 2nd, we are looking at urban creeks with Julian Mary Jones. She's a master's candidate with the University of Alberta and also works with EPCOR on a modeling project. So the topic is exploring Edmonton's creeks, how modeling data can shape watershed health. And that's it for today. So thank you so much, everyone. Thank you, John and Brent, for joining us. And I hope everyone has a lovely rest of their day.